The click of the heavy oak door closing echoed the finality Eleanor Sterling felt in her heart. After 35 years of marriage, of building a life and an empire from nothing, she was being discarded like a vintage dress that no longer fit her husband's modern aesthetic. The words from his lawyer, James Peterson, swirled in her mind, cold and sharp as shards of glass. He intends to leave you with the legal minimum. His official position is that your contribution to his success was negligible. Negligible. A single word to erase a lifetime of sacrifice, support, and shared dreams. Little did they know the proof of her true worth wasn't in a bank account, but locked away in the darkness of a forgotten steel box, waiting for the one person who still remembered the combination. The Sterling Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the San Francisco social season, an event Eleanor had orchestrated for 2 decades. Tonight, however, she felt like a ghost haunting her own masterpiece. She moved through the glittering throng at the Fairmont Hotel's grand ballroom, the silk of her navy gown whispering against the marble floors. She smiled, she greeted. She accepted hollow compliments on the magnificent floral arrangements, all while a chasm of ice grew between her and the man standing at the center of the room. Her husband, Richard Sterling. Richard, at 68, was more formidable than ever. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed. His bespoke tuxedo fit him like a second skin, and his voice, honed by decades of commanding boardrooms, boomed with authority. He was the visionary behind Sterling Data Solutions, a tech behemoth that had reshaped the landscape of predictive analytics. And standing just a little too close to him, basking in his reflected glory, was Victoria Vance. Victoria was everything Eleanor was not. She was 32, with a razor-sharp bob and an even sharper ambition. Hired 2 years ago as Richard's executive vice president, she had quickly become his shadow, his confidant, his gatekeeper. Her official role was managing corporate strategy, but her unofficial one, Eleanor had come to realize with a sickening dread, was managing Richard himself. Eleanor Darling cooed a socialite, her face a taut mask of cosmetic perfection. The decor is simply divine. You've outdone yourself, as always. Thank you, Beatrice. Eleanor replied, her voice smooth despite the tremor in her hands. Her eyes found Richard again. He was laughing at something Victoria had whispered in his ear. The gesture was intimate proprietary. In the past, he would have sought Eleanor's gaze across a crowded room, sharing a silent joke, a flicker of connection that affirmed they were a team. Now his eyes slid past her as if she were part of the scenery. Later, as a senator droned on during the speeches, Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She sat at the head table, a seat of honor that felt more like a cage. Richard was at the podium, and Victoria stood near the stage, watching him with an unnerving intensity. And as we look to the future, Richard was saying, we must be willing to trim the fat, to discard legacy systems that no longer serve us, to embrace a leaner, more agile way forward. Sentimentality is the enemy of progress. His eyes, for a brief, cold second, met Eleanor's. The message was unmistakable. She was the legacy system. She was the sentimentality holding him back. The polite applause that followed sounded like handfuls of dirt being thrown on a coffin. The drive home to their Pacific Heights mansion was a silent, suffocating affair. The city lights smeared across the windows of the Bentley, but Eleanor saw nothing. The man beside her was a stranger, his familiar scent of expensive cologne and cigars now alien and threatening. Was everything to your satisfaction tonight, Richard? She asked, her voice quiet. He didn't look at her. It was fine. Victoria's team handled the logistics flawlessly. We raised a record amount. Victoria's team. For 20 years, it had been Eleanor's event. She had personally courted the donors, chosen the caterers, and agonized over every detail. I'm glad she said, her throat tight. When they arrived home, he went straight to his study, the one he'd had soundproofed last year. She heard the soft snick of the lock engaging. It had become a nightly ritual. He was locking her out of his life, one door at a time. Eleanor walked through the cavernous, silent house. It was filled with priceless art and antique furniture trophies of their success. But it was a museum of a marriage, not a home. She went to their master suite and looked at the portrait above the fireplace. It was painted on their 20th anniversary. In it, they were smiling. His arm, wrapped securely around her waist, their eyes full of shared history and a future they thought was guaranteed. The woman in the portrait seemed so confident, so loved. Eleanor touched her own cheek, feeling the cool, fragile skin. Who was she now? She was Mrs. Richard Sterling, a title that once felt like a badge of honor, but now felt like a brand. And she had a horrifying feeling that the brand was about to be discontinued. The days that followed the gala were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The coldness that had been creeping into their marriage became a glacier, relentless and crushing. It began with finances. Eleanor went to her favorite boutique in Union Square to buy a gift for their son Daniel's birthday, only to have her private credit card declined. The embarrassment was a hot flush on her neck. The cashier, a young woman who had always fawned over her, looked at her with a mixture of pity and confusion. Eleanor called the credit card company from the car, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sterling," the operator said, her voice tinny and impersonal. "The primary card holder, Mr. Richard Sterling, has frozen the account." She sat in the leather-scented silence of her car, the world outside seeming to blur. He hadn't said a word. No discussion, no warning. Just a quiet, brutal severing. She drove home and tried to talk to him that evening. He was in his study as usual. She knocked. "Richard, we need to talk." A moment of silence. "Then I'm busy." "Eleanor, this can't wait. My card was declined today." "Did you freeze the account?" The door opened a crack. He looked at her, his face an impassive mask. "Our expenses have become exorbitant. I'm streamlining our finances. All future household expenditures are to be submitted to Ms. Vance for approval." The mention of Victoria's name was a deliberate twist of the knife. "You want me to submit a budget to your assistant for the home I've run for 35 years. "She is not my assistant. She is the EVP of my company," he corrected her coldly. "And yes, it's a matter of fiscal responsibility." He closed the door before she could respond. The household staff, many of whom had been with them for decades, were caught in the crossfire. Memos began to appear, printed on Sterling Data Solutions letterhead, issued from Victoria Vance's office. They detailed new austere protocols. The weekly order of fresh flowers was deemed an unnecessary expense. The menus for their meals, which Eleanor had always planned with their private chef, now had to adhere to a strict, cost-controlled list. Victoria herself began appearing at the house with increasing frequency, ostensibly for meetings with Richard. She would walk through the halls with an air of ownership, her heels clicking decisively on the marble. She'd offer Eleanor thin, predatory smiles. "Eleanor, lovely to see you," she'd say, her eyes cataloguing the room as if already deciding on new furniture. "Richard and I are just finalizing the Q4 projections. He works so terribly hard, doesn't he? I worry about him." The implication was clear. I am the one who understands him now. You are just a fixture. Eleanor tried to connect with her son Daniel, who worked as an architect in Seattle. He had always been a sensitive, perceptive young man, but his relationship with his father had grown strained in recent years, fractured by Richard's overbearing nature. "Mum, what's going on?" Daniel asked over the phone, his voice laced with concern. I tried to call Dad to talk about his birthday, and his assistant kept putting me off. Said his calendar was full for the next month. That would be Victoria. Eleanor said, her voice weary. Yeah, her. She's a piece of work. Dad sounds different when he talks about her. It's like he's trying to impress her. What's her deal? Her deal. Eleanor said, a bitter taste in her mouth is to make herself indispensable, and to make me obsolete. The final, most personal blow came a week later. Eleanor had a small private studio at the back of the house, where she restored antique books, a passion she had cultivated for years. It was her sanctuary, the one place that was truly hers. She arrived one morning to find 2 workmen packing her delicate tools and leather-bound volumes into cardboard boxes. Victoria Vance stood in the doorway holding a tablet. What is this? Eleanor demanded, her heart pounding. Richard has decided to convert this space into a home, gym, and wellness center. Victoria announced, not a flicker of remorse in her eyes. It's part of his new executive health regimen. All your materials are being moved to a climate-controlled storage unit in South San Francisco. We've already paid for the first year. She said it as if she were doing Eleanor a favor. Eleanor looked at the mess, at the violation of her sacred space. The leather tooling, the delicate gold leaf, the smell of old paper and glue, all being swept away to make room for a Peloton and a juice bar. Get out, Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with a rage she hadn't felt in years. Victoria's smile was triumphant. Of course. The men have their instructions. That night, Eleanor didn't knock on Richard's door. She sat in the dark of her living room staring at the portrait of a marriage that was now a lie. She wasn't just being ignored. She was being systematically erased from her own life. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was only the beginning. The unraveling was almost complete. The final cut was coming. The call came on a Tuesday morning. The caller ID read Peterson Legal Services, but Eleanor knew it was James. James Peterson had been their lawyer for 30 years. He had drafted the paperwork for their first mortgage, celebrated the incorporation of Richard's company, and advised them on their estate planning. He was more than a lawyer. He was a friend, the godfather to their son Daniel. Eleanor, he said, his voice heavy with a professional somberness that failed to mask his personal discomfort. Richard has asked me to set a meeting with you. He would prefer it be at my office. Would tomorrow at 10 a.m. work a meeting about what, James? She asked, though she already knew. The dread was a physical weight in her stomach. I think it's best we discuss it in person, Ellie. The use of her old nickname, a relic from sunnier, happier times, was more alarming than any legal jargon. It was a gesture of sympathy, a buffer for the coming blow. The next morning, Eleanor dressed with deliberate care. She chose a simple but elegant grey sheath dress and her grandmother's pearls. It was armor. She would not walk into this execution looking defeated. The drive to James's downtown office felt surreal. The city she loved, the streets she knew so well, looked foreign, as if she were seeing them through a distorted lens. James Peterson's office was a sanctuary of old money and quiet power, dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and a view of the Bay Bridge. James, a kind-faced man with weary eyes, greeted her himself, forgoing his secretary. He led her to 2 plush armchairs, bypassing the large conference table. This was meant to be personal, which somehow made it worse. He poured her a glass of water, his hands fumbling slightly. "James, just tell me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He took a deep breath and looked her in the eye. "Eleanor Richard has instructed me to begin divorce proceedings." There it was. The words hung in the air, clinical and brutal. She nodded slowly, absorbing the impact. It wasn't a surprise, not really. But the reality of it was still a physical shock, a punch to the gut that stole her breath. "I see she managed." "There's more," he said, his gaze dropping to the file on the table between them. "He has also instructed me to draw up a new last will and testament. In it, he is disinheriting you." This was the part she hadn't expected. A divorce was one thing, but disinheritance, it was an act of total repudiation, an attempt to erase her from his legacy entirely. "He can't do that," she said, a spark of defiance cutting through the shock. "We've been married for 35 years. California is a community property state. Everything we have, we built together." James looked pained. He's prepared for that. He and his new legal team. He gestured vaguely, indicating a team she was clearly not a part of, are arguing that the vast majority of the wealth was generated from Sterling Data Solutions, which they classify as separate property. They've prepared a paper trail stock options, granted before certain dates intellectual property filings. "It's a fortress, Eleanor. A fortress of lies," she whispered. "I was there, James. I was there when it was just a dream, in our tiny Palo Alto apartment. I worked 2 jobs, so he could quit his and focus on coding. I hosted dinners for the first angel investors. I named the company. I know, Ellie. I know," he said, his voice gentle. "But Richard's official position, the statement he gave me to use as the basis for the settlement offer." He hesitated, clearly reluctant to say the words. "What is it, James? What is his official position?" James picked up a sheet of paper, though he didn't need to read it. The words were clearly seared into his memory. "He is prepared to argue in court that you were a supportive spouse, but that your contribution to the creation of his wealth and the success of his business was, and I quote, sentimental and ultimately negligible. Negligible. The word from the gala. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was the opening salvo of his campaign. He was rewriting their history, casting her as nothing more than a decorative accessory to his genius. The settlement he is offering James continued pushing a document across the table is the house in Pacific Heights, though he will retain ownership of the art collection and a one-time alimony payment that is, frankly, Eleanor, it's an insult. It's enough to live comfortably, but it's less than 0.1% of his estimated net worth. It's designed to send a message. She stared at the document without seeing it. All she could see was Richard's face years ago beaming at her across a cluttered desk, littered with circuit boards. "We did it, Ellie," he'd said, holding up their first signed contract. "We did it." Where had that man gone? "Who is his new legal team?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "A firm called Vance and Associates," James said, and the final piece clicked into place. Vance, as in Victoria Vance. James nodded grimly. "Her father is the senior partner. She's been advising Richard on this for months." Of course. This wasn't just Richard's cruelty. It was a meticulously planned corporate takeover of her life orchestrated by Victoria. She hadn't just seduced him with her youth and ambition. She had provided him with the legal machinery and the soulless narrative to cut Eleanor out completely. Eleanor stood up her composure, a thin veneer over a core of incandescent rage. "Thank you, James. I understand. Ellie, you need to fight this. Hire the best divorce attorney in the city. I can give you some names off the record." "Oh, I will fight," she said, looking out the window at the distant, indifferent shimmer of the bay. "But I don't think this will be won in a courtroom. It will be won with the truth." She walked out of the office, leaving the insulting settlement offer on the table. She had no plan, no allies, and dwindling resources. But she had something Richard and Victoria had forgotten. She had the memory of the truth. Now she just needed to find a way to prove it. Defeat was a heavy cloak. For 2 days, Eleanor drifted through the mansion like a spectre, the lawyer's words, a constant haunting whisper, negligible. Each object she passed seemed to mock her. The Ming vase in the foyer, the Impressionist painting in the dining room, they were Richard's assets, not theirs. She was just the curator of a life she was being evicted from. The staff treated her with a hushed reverence that bordered on pity. Maria, the head housekeeper, who had been with them for over 20 years, would leave cups of tea for her, her kind, wrinkled face etched with a worry she couldn't voice. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the low hum of Richard's ambition emanating from behind his locked study door. On the 3rd day, she knew she had to act. The divorce papers would be served any day. She had to start packing, separating her personal effects from the life she was being forced to leave behind. She started in the attic, a repository of forgotten decades. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a dormer window, illuminating stacks of boxes. Old furniture shrouded in white sheets and the ghosts of a shared past. She opened a trunk labeled Daniel, Childhood. Inside were his first pair of shoes, a lock of his baby hair, and his favorite teddy bear threadbare and missing an eye. A wave of profound love and sorrow washed over her. This was her contribution. A son they had raised, a family she had nurtured. Was that negligible too? Next she moved to a box, simply marked R&E. The beginning. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of relics from their early years, a dried corsage from their first date, ticket stubs from a U2 concert in 1987, a menu from a cheap Italian restaurant where he had proposed, and photos. Dozens of photos of 2 young, hopeful people with terrible haircuts and brilliant smiles, convinced they could conquer the world. There was a picture of her waitressing at a diner, the exhaustion in her eyes, belying her smile. The back of the photo had Richard's familiar scrawl, "My Ellie working to fund our dream." "I will repay you 1,000 times over." 1989. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. 1,000 times over. As she sifted through the yellowed papers and faded photographs, a memory surfaced hazy at first, then sharpening into focus. It was from their first year of business, when Sterling Solutions was just Richard, a rented computer, and a ream of unpaid bills in their cramped apartment. They had just landed their first major client, a small accounting firm called Henderson & Co. It was a $5,000 contract, a fortune to them at the time. Richard had been ecstatic and terrified. "We need to be professional," he'd said, pacing their tiny living room. "We need a proper place for our important documents. Something solid. Something permanent." The next day he came home with a second-hand safe. It was a behemoth, a dark grey steel box made by the Mosler Safe Company, weighing nearly 400 pounds. It was absurdly large for their small apartment. "What on earth is that, Richard?" she had asked, laughing. "This," he'd announced grandly, "is our foundation. This will hold the bedrock of our company. The articles of incorporation, our first contract, the source code. The things that truly matter." She helped him move it into their tiny spare bedroom which served as his office. He'd spun the heavy dial with a flourish and set the combination. "What's the code?" she'd asked. He had grinned, his eyes sparkling with the love and ambition that had once defined him. The day our dream officially became a business. 1149 for the date of the Henderson contract. January 14th, 1990. The day we became real. Don't you ever forget it, Ellie. It's the beginning of everything. The safe. They had moved it with them to every new home, a silent, heavy testament to their origins. When they bought the Pacific Heights mansion, the movers had complained bitterly about hauling it up to Richard's old study on the second floor. But in the last decade, as Sterling Data Solutions grew into a global entity, Richard had moved into the larger, modern, soundproofed office downstairs. The old study had become a glorified storage room, filled with outdated electronics and boxes of old financial records. And the safe. It was still there. He hadn't mentioned it or opened it in at least 15 years. It was a relic of a past he was now determined to erase. A jolt like an electric current shot through the Eleanor. The things that truly matter. What was in that safe? She remembered him placing the Henderson contract inside and a floppy disk with his first proprietary algorithm. But what else? What other pieces of their shared history were locked inside that forgotten vault? It was a sliver of hope, perhaps, a foolish one. But it was the only one she had. The man he was now had forgotten the man he used to be. But maybe, just maybe, that old steel box held the proof. It held the voice of the young, grateful, loving husband who knew without a doubt that he could never have done it without her. The bedrock of their company. Her heart began to beat with a purpose it hadn't felt in months. She had to get into that safe. The mission to open the safe felt like a spy thriller set in her own home. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was enemy territory. Victoria's presence was a constant threat. She now had a security key fob and would often let herself in unannounced, citing urgent business with Richard. Eleanor knew that Victoria was also supervising the pre-divorce asset inventory, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The old study was on that list. Time was running out. Eleanor needed an ally. Her thoughts immediately went to Maria, the housekeeper. Maria was a quiet, observant woman who had raised her own children in the years she had worked for the Sterlings. She had seen the slow, painful decay of the marriage and harbored a deep, unspoken disdain for Victoria's imperious manner. Eleanor found her in the laundry room, methodically folding linens. "Maria," she began, her voice low. "I need to ask you for a favor. A very important one." Maria stopped folding and looked at Eleanor. Her dark, intelligent eyes full of concern. "For you, Mrs. Sterling? Anything?" Eleanor explained quickly. She needed to get into the old study undisturbed for at least an hour. She needed a diversion, something that would keep both Richard and, more importantly, Victoria occupied and away from the second floor. A flicker of defiance lit up Maria's face. She thought for a moment, then a slow smile spread across her lips. "Mr. Sterling has a video conference with the Tokyo board at 3 p.m. tomorrow. He demands absolute silence." And Miss Vance. She called this morning to say she will be here to supervise him. She has a terrible allergy to dust. A deep cleaning of the main floor ventilation system seems overdue. It can get very messy. Very dusty. It was perfect. The next day, at 2:55 p.m., Eleanor's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. From the top of the grand staircase, she watched as Maria and 2 other staff members, armed with industrial-sized vacuums and cleaning equipment, began to work on the air vents in the main foyer, directly outside Richard's new study. Victoria arrived dressed in a pristine white pantsuit and immediately recoiled. "What is all this?" she snapped at Maria. "Routine maintenance, ma'am," Maria said with an expression of perfect innocence. "Terribly sorry for the disruption." A cloud of dust puffed out from a vent. Victoria coughed, waving her hand in front of her face with disgust. "We'll see that you keep it contained." She shot a venomous glare up the stairs towards Eleanor, before disappearing into Richard's study, slamming the door to escape the noise and the dust. This was her chance. Eleanor slipped down the hall to the old study. The room was just as she remembered, stale air stacks of obsolete computer monitors and the hulking grey safe squatting in the corner like a forgotten god. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. She knelt before it, her hands trembling as she wiped the grime off the combination dial. The tumblers felt cold and stiff. She took a calming breath, picturing Richard's young, enthusiastic face. 11490. January 14th. She began to turn the dial. 4 times to the right, stopping on 1. 3 times to the left, past 1, stopping on 14. 2 times to the right, past 14, stopping on 9. Then slowly, once to the left, heading for 0. Her heart pounded with each click of the tumblers. The memories were so vivid, the taste of cheap champagne they'd used to celebrate that first contract, the way he had lifted her up and spun her around in their tiny apartment, the feeling of infinite possibility stretched out before them. She reached 0, and the dial stopped. She held her breath and pulled the heavy levered handle. It didn't budge. Panic seized her. Had she remembered it wrong? Was the date wrong? Had he changed it years ago and never told her? She tried again, carefully, deliberately. Right to 1, left to 14, right to 9, left to 0. She pulled the handle. Nothing. It was locked as tight as Richard's heart. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. It was a stupid, desperate plan. Of course it wouldn't work. The past was as sealed away as the contents of this safe. Downstairs, she could hear the faint drone of the vacuums, a countdown timer on her opportunity. She slumped against the cold steel, defeated. What could she have gotten wrong, the date? No, she was certain of it. January 14th, 1990. The day their dream became real. She whispered the numbers again. 14, 90. And then it hit her. A detail so small, so simple, she had overlooked it. He was a programmer, a man who dealt in precision in data strings. He wouldn't have just said 90. He would have used the full year, 1990. But the dial only went up to 99. How would he represent it? Maybe the code was longer. She thought back to his words. The day our dream officially became a business. The contract was dated January 14th, but when did they actually receive the check? The money that made it all real. She remembered it clearly because it was the day after Valentine's Day. They had been too broke to celebrate, and then the check arrived by courier. February 15th, 21590. Her hands shaking with renewed hope, she tried the new combination. Right to 2, left to 15, right to 9, left to 0. She tugged the handle. It was still stuck. Despair washed over her again. She was about to give up when her eyes fell on the manufacturer's plate, Mosler Safe Company. It jogged another memory, Richard complaining about the dial. "It's an old model," he'd said. "You have to give the handle a good upward knock before pulling down." A forgotten quirk from a forgotten time. Taking a deep breath, she entered the second combination one last time. 21590. She gripped the handle, rapped it sharply upwards with the palm of her other hand, and then pulled down with all her might. There was a deep groaning thud as the locking bolts retracted. The heavy door swung open with a hiss of displaced air, releasing the smell of old paper, and sealed off time. For a moment, she just stared into the dark interior, her breath catching in her throat. She had done it. She had unlocked the past. Now she had to pray that it held the key to her future. The interior of the safe was small, barely a foot deep. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, smelling faintly of leather and aging paper. Eleanor's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small, neat stack of items. This was it. The foundation. The bedrock of sterling data solutions. Her hands, still trembling, reached in. The first thing she touched was a thin, leather-bound journal. It was a simple 5-year diary, the kind you could buy at any stationery store. The cover was worn, the corners soft with age. She opened it. The first page was inscribed in Richard's familiar angular handwriting. R. Sterling. The Enterprise Log, 1989. She carefully lifted it out and placed it on the floor. Beneath it was a stack of manila folders. The top one was labeled Henderson & Co. Inside was the original contract, its dot matrix print faded but still legible. She smiled faintly. This was the document that had started it all. The next folder was labeled Founding Docs. It contained their original articles of incorporation and business registration forms. Her name was nowhere on them. Of course, at the time it had seemed practical. He was the programmer, the face of the company. She was the support system, the silent partner. A pang of her past naivety struck her. Then she saw it. Tucked at the very bottom of the safe, almost hidden in the shadows, was a simple folded piece of paper. It wasn't in a folder. It looked like a page torn from a notepad. She unfolded it carefully. It was a cocktail napkin from the Tipsy Owl, a bar near their old apartment where they used to go for cheap beers and big dreams. On it, in a chaotic mix of their two handwritings, was a brainstorm of names for their fledgling company. Data Forge, Logic Stream, Quantum Leap Analytics, and then in her own loopy cursive script, circled several times Sterling Solutions. Below it, Richard had written, Perfect. It sounds like quality. It sounds like us. She had forgotten. In the grand narrative of his singular genius, this small, crucial contribution had been completely erased from her memory and his. He hadn't even named his own company. She had. With a growing sense of urgency, she turned her attention back to the journal. She sat on the dusty floor of the storage room, the sounds of the vacuums downstairs, a distant hum, and began to read. October 5th, 1989. Landlord threatening eviction again. Ellie pawned her grandmother's necklace today to make rent. She told me not to worry, that it was just a thing. But I know it broke her heart. I swear I will buy her a diamond 10 times its size. I feel like a failure, but she looks at me like I've already succeeded. How can she have so much faith? January 14th, 1990. Henderson. Signed. They signed $5,000. "We're real," Ellie cried when I told her. She held the contract like it was our baby. In a way it is. Tonight we are not a broke programmer and a tired waitress. Tonight we are the founders of an empire. March 2nd, 1990. The code has a bug I can't fix. I've been staring at it for 36 hours straight. I almost threw the monitor out the window. Ellie came in at 3 a.m., sat me down, and made me explain the entire problem to her. She doesn't know a thing about C++, but she knows how to listen. Just talking it through with her, I saw the flaw. She didn't fix the code. She fixed me. She is the operating system for my entire life. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. She read on page after page a detailed account of their shared struggle and his deep reliance on her. He documented every sacrifice she made, every word of encouragement she gave, every brilliant insight she offered from a layman's perspective that helped him simplify his product for the market. He didn't describe her as a supportive spouse. He described her as his partner, his co-founder in spirit and in fact. She turned to the last entry dated December 31st, 1990. 1 year in. We're still not profitable, but we're alive. Looking back, there is no Sterling Solutions without Eleanor. It's not just the money from her tips or the roof she kept over our heads. It's her belief. It's the invisible foundational work that no one else sees. One day, when this is all a massive success, I need to make this right. Legally. She's not just my wife. She's a 50% owner in this dream, whether her name is on the paperwork or not. Eleanor closed the journal, her heart aching with the sheer tragic weight of his forgotten words. This was the proof. The truth in his own hand. She began to place everything carefully back into the safe, intending to take only the journal and the napkin. As she lifted the journal, something slipped from between its back pages and fluttered to the floor. It was a single, crisp sheet of paper, folded in 3. It was heavier than the journal pages, with a formal letterhead. She picked it up and unfolded it. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a legal document, a notarized document. At the top, in stark official lettering, it read, Founders Agreement. It was dated January 15th, 1990, the day after they signed the Henderson contract. It stated in clear, unambiguous legal language that in consideration for her non-monetary, foundational contributions, including initial seed capital derived from personal employment, strategic brand development, specifically the naming of the company, and ongoing operational support, Eleanor Sterling was hereby recognized as a 50% equity partner in the intellectual property and future capital of the venture known as Sterling Solutions. At the bottom were 2 signatures, Richard's bold and confident, and hers a bit shaky. Below them was the embossed indelible seal and signature of a notary public. She stared at it, a memory struggling to surface. She remembered signing something, Richard telling her it was just a formality for the files to make sure you're protected. She had been so young, so trusting. She'd signed it and never thought of it again. He had put it in his new safe for safekeeping, and in the whirlwind of his rising success, he had simply forgotten it existed. This wasn't just a moral argument anymore. This wasn't a sentimental plea. This was a legally binding contract. He hadn't just forgotten his love for her. He had forgotten that he had made her his equal partner, and his meticulously crafted plan to disinherit her was about to collide with the one thing he and his army of lawyers had never accounted for, the bedrock of truth he had locked away himself. Armed with the bedrock of truth, Eleanor moved with the chilling calm of a general on the eve of a decisive battle. There were no frantic calls, no tearful outbursts. Rage had been forged into something harder, sharper purpose. She meticulously photocopied every page of Richard's journal and the notarized founder's agreement. The originals were placed in a safe deposit box at a bank downtown, a fortress of her own. Only then did she call James Peterson. "James," she said, her voice a polished stone, smooth and unyielding. "I need you to arrange one final meeting. Richard, myself, and his legal counsel from Vance and Associates. Tell them I have a counter-proposal to discuss regarding the dissolution of the marital assets." James, who had known her as a gentle soul for 3 decades, heard the profound shift in her tone. He sensed the steel beneath the velvet. "Of course, Eleanor. We're the main conference room at Sterling Data Solutions," she replied without hesitation. He built that tower as a monument to himself. I think it's the most fitting place for him to be reminded of its true foundation. 2 days later, Eleanor walked through the gleaming glass doors of the Sterling Tower. The lobby was a cathedral of minimalist wealth, all brushed steel and white marble, dominated by a 20-foot digital display of the company's soaring stock price. Employees, most of whom only knew her as a face in the annual report, stared as she passed a relic from a bygone era, suddenly walking among them. She ignored their curious glances, her posture perfect, her gaze fixed forward. She was not a ghost haunting this place. She was its returning sovereign. The conference room on the 50th floor was Richard's inner sanctum. One wall was a panoramic window offering a godlike view of San Francisco. At the head of the impossibly long mahogany table sat Richard, flanked by 2 severe-looking lawyers from Vance and Associates, and seated just behind his right shoulder like a vizier, whispering in a king's ear, was Victoria Vance. Dressed in a blood-red power suit, she radiated triumphant ownership. Her smile when she saw Eleanor was a predatory slash. "Eleanor," Richard began, his voice dripping with the patronizing magnanimity of a victor. "I'm glad you've decided to be sensible. This will be much less painful for everyone if you simply accept the generous terms we've offered." Eleanor met his gaze, and for the first time in a long time, she did not look away. She walked to her seat opposite him, placing her slim leather briefcase on the table with a soft, definitive click. James sat beside her, a silent, steady presence. "I am not here to accept your terms, Richard," she said, her voice calm and carrying in the acoustically perfect room. "I am here to present mine." She opened her briefcase, but instead of legal files, she first drew out the flimsy, stained cocktail napkin. She didn't slide it. She stood, walked the length of the table, and placed it directly in front of him. He blinked at it, confused. "What is this garbage?" That, Eleanor said, returning to her seat, is the first official document of our company. You might recognize my handwriting on the name you chose. Or rather, the name I chose. Richard stared at the circled words, Sterling Solutions. A flicker of something annoyance, confusion, a deeply buried memory crossed his face. Victoria leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "This is irrelevant nonsense." "Is it?" Eleanor asked softly. She then took out the worn, leather-bound journal. She didn't offer it to Richard. She pushed it across the table to James. James, you were there for much of this. Would you please read the entry dated March 2nd, 1990? As James's grave voice filled the room, reading Richard's own words about his desperation, his near failure, and his absolute reliance on her, calling her the operating system for my entire life, the atmosphere began to shift. Richard's face, once a mask of arrogant control, began to crumble. He was no longer looking at his wife. He was hearing the earnest, desperate voice of his younger self. Enough. Victoria snapped her composure, cracking. We are not here to listen to the sentimental diary entries of a man from 30 years ago. This has no legal standing, and it is a waste of our time. She is right, one of her father's lawyers chimed in, puffing out his chest. This is a legal proceeding. Mrs. Sterling, not a therapy session. I agree, Eleanor said, her voice dropping, drawing all focus. Sentimental value can be debated. A notarized seal cannot. She reached into her briefcase one last time. She pulled out the single, crisp document. She stood once more and placed the founder's agreement in the very center of the table. The silence that descended was absolute, a crushing weight that seemed to suck the air from the room. The Vance lawyers grabbed the document simultaneously, their professional veneers dissolving into naked shock. One of them began tracing the raised notary seal with his finger, as if he couldn't believe it was real. Victoria shot out of her chair, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. Reading the clear, unambiguous language that recognized Eleanor Sterling as a 50% equity partner, she finally understood. Her entire 2-year campaign, the careful manipulation, the legal machinations, the seduction of a powerful man, it was all built on a false premise. She hadn't been targeting a dependent wife for removal. She had been trying to swindle a silent, equal partner. She spun on Richard, her voice a venomous hiss. You told me she did nothing. You told me she was a footnote. How could you be so stupid as to forget this? Richard didn't answer her. He was catatonic, his gaze fixed on the document on his own youthful, arrogant signature beside Eleanor's. The fortress of lies he had built around himself, the narrative of the solitary genius, had been leveled by a single sheet of paper he himself had signed and hidden away. Ellie. He whispered the name, a ghost on his lips. I forgot. It wasn't an excuse. It was a confession. A confession of a failure so profound it was almost unfathomable. He had forgotten the most important promise he had ever made. Eleanor looked at the broken man before her. Yes, you did, she said, her voice not triumphant, but filled with an immense aching sorrow for the man he had once been. You forgot everything that mattered. The spell was broken. One of the Vance lawyers cleared his throat, his face pale. This document, he said, his voice strained, changes everything. It predates the vast majority of the company's growth. It establishes Mrs. Sterling's foundational equity not as community property, but as her own separate originating stake in the venture. The legal and financial implications were an earthquake. Richard didn't have to just divide marital assets. He owed her half the company. The fight drained from him completely. He slumped in his chair, looking aged and defeated. He looked at Victoria's furious, contorted face, then back at Eleanor's calm, resolute expression. In that moment, he saw the full, devastating scope of his betrayal. Without another word, he pressed a button on the console in front of him. Mr. Davies, he said, his voice a hollow echo of its usual command. Please come to the main conference room and escort Ms. Vance from the premises. Her access is revoked effective immediately. Pack the contents of her office and have them couriered to her residence." Victoria stared at him aghast before security arrived and silently, firmly led her away from the emperor she had so nearly stolen. The divorce proceeded, but it was a surrender, not a negotiation. Eleanor, advised by James, did not demand a catastrophic liquidation. She was smarter than that. She took exactly what the agreement stipulated: her 50% equity. A transfer of stock, not a payout. She didn't want his money. She wanted her company. Her first board meeting was 3 months later. She walked in and took her seat at the table, not as Mrs. Sterling, the founder's former wife, but as Eleanor Vance, a titan of industry in her own right. Richard, sitting opposite her, could not meet her eyes. Her first motion was to establish a multi-million-dollar employee profit-sharing program and a charitable foundation dedicated to digital literacy for underprivileged youth, funded by a percentage of corporate profits initiatives Richard had always dismissed as unnecessary expenses. It passed unanimously. She had lost a husband, but she had reclaimed her legacy. She had walked into his kingdom prepared to fight for a piece of it, only to discover locked away in the dark the undeniable proof that half of it had always been hers. This story is a powerful reminder that our true value is often hidden not in the accolades we receive, but in the foundational sacrifices we make that others may forget. Eleanor's story shows us that truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, has a way of coming to light. It's a testament to the fact that integrity and resilience are the most valuable assets we can possess. It wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming a history that was stolen from her and proving that her contributions were never, ever negligible. If this story of resilience, hidden truths, and ultimate vindication resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you want more stories like this. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale of justice and empowerment. Thank you for listening.